Kazu was the kind of person most people overlooked. Not because he was invisible exactly, but because there was nothing theatrical about him. He sat in the middle rows of every classroom, answered questions when asked, and spent his lunch hours reviewing his notes from the morning. He believed, in a way that was almost quaint among his classmates, that effort was its own kind of dignity. You put in the work showed up in your results, and the results spoke for themselves. He was rarely wrong about this. His quiz scores were consistently high. His exam performances were methodical, sometimes brilliant in their precision, always earned. The teachers who noticed him, and they did notice him quietly in the careful way teachers mark the students worth watching, spoke about him in staff room conversations with a particular quality of anticipation, the way you discuss a plant that was going to grow into something significant if left to its own devices. Kazu was aware of this attention in the peripheral way of someone who doesn't seek recognition but doesn't mind receiving it. He kept his head down. He did the work. He went home. Home was a small apartment shared with his older sister, May. She was a year ahead of him, socially fluent in the way Kazu was not, the kind of person who remembered every name, who moved through groups with an ease that looked effortless because she had worked very hard to make it look that way. She had her own orbit, her own carefully maintained reputation, and she regarded Kazu's quiet habits with the mild impatience of someone who couldn't understand why anyone would choose not to play the social game. They got along in the way of siblings who occupy the same space without quite sharing the same world. She cooked on Tuesdays. He cleaned on weekends. They watched the same television programs without talking about them afterward. It was a life. Kazu didn't need more than that. Or so he believed before the second year, before Raina, before everything changed. He first became aware of Raina the way you become aware of weather, gradually, and then all at once. She was in the same year as Kazu, a different class, but their paths crossed during the joint sessions that brought multiple classes together for certain subjects. She was immediately distinguishable, not because she was the loudest person in the room, but because she had a quality of complete awareness. She knew where everyone was, what they were doing, and how they were doing relative to each other at any given moment. It was the kind of social intelligence that looks like natural charisma from the outside, but requires constant, exhausting calibration to maintain. Raina maintained it effortlessly, or seemed to. By the beginning of their second year, she had built something that functioned like a small court. Not a clique, exactly. Cliques were obvious and therefore fragile. What Raina had was subtler, a network of people who trusted her opinions, who consulted her before making social decisions, who understood, without being told, that her approval was worth having. She wasn't cruel about it. That was the thing. She was charming and inclusive and generous with her attention in a way that made people feel chosen. The few who had seen the other side of her, the cold calculation behind the warmth, the way she filed away weaknesses like a librarian cataloging books, tended to stay very quiet about it. Kazu would eventually learn all of this, but in the beginning, he barely registered her at all. That changed when the teachers began making noise about a scholarship. The announcement came during morning homeroom, delivered in the careful, slightly over-rehearsed tone of a teacher who wanted to convey significance without appearing to play favorites. A scholarship opportunity, highly competitive, reserved for students demonstrating exceptional academic consistency across their first 2 years. A committee would review records in the coming months and select a candidate. Kazu heard this and felt something quiet and warm settle in his chest. He didn't say anything. He didn't look around the room or try to gauge other students' reactions. He just made a small note in the margin of his planner and went back to listening to the lesson. He didn't know that Raina, 2 rows over, had heard the same announcement and felt something entirely different. She had her own record to be proud of. Her grades were excellent. She had made sure of that, because she understood that intelligence and academic standing were social currency, and she was someone who kept close track of what she was owed. But the specific pattern the teachers seemed to be noticing in Kazu, the quiet consistency, the absence of any obvious ambition, the pure performance for its own sake quality of his work, was precisely the kind of thing that scholarship committees loved. She watched him over the following weeks with the focused attention of someone doing threat assessment. He didn't notice. He was busy studying. Raina didn't make moves loudly. That was her first principle. She had a circle of people she trusted, not because they were loyal to her in any deep sense, but because they were invested enough in her approval that they would carry her messages without examining them too closely. Hashi was the most reliable of these. A broad-shouldered boy with a good-natured face and a deep need to belong to something. He had been useful to Raina since early in first year. He asked few questions and followed instructions with the earnestness of a person who had never quite figured out that he was being used. Over a series of carefully casual conversations in the corridors and during lunch, Raina began to plant the seeds. She never said anything directly. Direct accusations were traceable. What she did instead was introduce doubt, small, deniable, shaped exactly to the gaps in people's knowledge. Isn't it interesting how well Kazu always does? You'd think someone so quiet would struggle more with the pressure. A pause. A look that communicated more than words. I'm not saying anything. I just think it's worth noticing. It worked the way seeds always work in prepared soil. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. By the end of the month, the whispers had taken on a life of their own. The original source had become untraceable. Kazu was aware of a change in the atmosphere around him, a slight withdrawal from certain classmates, a few conversations that stopped when he entered a room, but he couldn't identify the cause. He assumed it was social noise. He ignored it and kept studying. This, Raina noted, was a mistake on his part. The midterm exam was anticipated by the whole year group in the particular way of high-stakes events that will significantly affect the future. Kazu prepared for it the way he prepared for everything. Thoroughly, methodically, without drama. The morning of the exam, he arrived early, took his seat, and organized his materials. He didn't notice Hashi moving through the room behind him, didn't register the small, almost imperceptible placement of a folded slip of paper that Hashi, at a precisely planned moment, tucked into the side pocket of Kazu's bag. The exam began. Kazu worked through the questions with focused calm. When the teacher's attention was drawn, by a look from Raina, deliberately timed, and the inspection of Kazu's bag produced the cheat sheet, the sound of it seemed to come from very far away. Kazu looked at the paper in the teacher's hand and felt something cold and complete settle over him, like a lid being pressed down. He had never seen it before. He said so, clearly, without panic, because panic would have looked like guilt. But the whispers had done their work. The teachers, already carrying the faint residue of doubt that Raina had carefully cultivated over the preceding weeks, looked at him with expressions that were trying to be neutral and weren't quite managing it. The evidence was physical, tangible. It had been found in his bag. Kazu could see, with terrible clarity, that there was no argument he could make that would be believed. He was right. The aftermath unfolded with a kind of mechanical inevitability that left him feeling like a spectator in his own life. The scholarship list, which his name had been tentatively near, closed. The meeting with the teacher in charge was formal and humiliating. He was asked to prove his innocence and found himself unable to, because the evidence against him was real and the evidence of his honesty was invisible, existing only in the fact of his own character, which no one, apparently, trusted enough to weigh against a physical object found in his belongings. He walked out of the meeting and stood in the corridor for a long moment, alone. He had never done anything wrong. The days that followed had a quality that Kazu would remember for a long time as a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of people choosing not to speak. Some classmates were actively cruel, which was easier in a way. Cruelty had a clear shape. A few called him a cheater when they thought he could hear. Others made small, pointed comments about the scholarship that had been, pointedly, no longer his. Worse were the ones who simply withdrew. The casual friendships that had existed in the comfortable background of a shared classroom, borrowing a pen, comparing quiz answers, the small social commerce of daily life, all of it quietly dried up. People who would have nodded at him in the corridor 2 weeks ago now found reasons to look somewhere else. The worst was Hannah. He had known her since first year. They had studied together after class on so many afternoons that the routine had become something he relied on without examining, a small and consistent pleasure in the structure of his week. She had praised his approach to studying in a way that was genuine rather than flattering, noticing specific things, asking questions that showed she was actually paying attention. When the rumors reached her, she didn't come to him immediately. He noticed her hesitation and waited, which was his nature. He assumed she would ask him directly. He had his answer ready, simple, true, undefended by anything except itself. One afternoon in the corridor, he tried to explain. She listened, or seemed to. Then she shook her head, and her expression was not angry, but something worse, disappointed, and already decided. "I didn't expect this from you," she said. There was a brief hurt in her eyes, the genuine hurt of someone who had believed in something and found it insufficient, and then she was gone. Kazu stood in the empty corridor and understood what it felt like to be convicted of something real by someone who had seen nothing. The hollow space that opened in his chest that afternoon didn't close for a long time. May heard about it. Inevitably, the school was small enough that information moved like water through every available channel, and Kazu's situation was the kind of story that traveled fast because it was simultaneously specific and universal. She came home one evening with the particular expression of someone carrying something heavy they don't want to put down in the living room. She waited until dinner and then said, flatly, that she had heard what was being said. Kazu tried to explain. She let him finish. Then she said that it didn't matter whether he had done it or not, which was, he recognized, the most honest and devastating thing she could have said. What mattered was the impact. The whispers had reached her circles now. People were asking her about her brother, and the questions had an edge. She had spent a long time building the social standing she had, and watching it develop a crack because of something she had no control over was not something she was willing to accept quietly. She told him he needed to fix it. He said he didn't know how to fix something he hadn't caused. She said that was his problem to solve. He went to his room that night with the specific loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people and untouched by any of them. The cleaning rotation came around, as it always did, a compulsory program, students assigned in rotating pairs to maintain different areas of the school. By some arrangement that probably wasn't accidental, Kazu frequently found himself assigned to the less desirable locations. The storage areas, the rarely visited corridors. He didn't complain. Complaint felt pointless. It was during one of these sessions, in a storage room at the back of the arts building, the kind of space that accumulates things without anyone quite knowing how, that he found the box. It was wooden, unremarkable, tucked behind a collapsed rack of old curtain material. Inside, pencils, dried-up rubber erasers, a broken compass, the accumulated refuse of years of classroom life. And at the bottom, wrapped loosely in a cloth that might once have been part of something else, an old pocket watch. He picked it up carefully. The case was silver, or had been, now oxidized to a matte gray that caught the light in irregular patches. The face was cracked, a single fracture running from the 9 to somewhere past the center, and the glass was cloudy with age. But the mechanism was still running. A faint, slightly irregular ticking came from inside, not quite matching any clock he had ever heard. Not wrong, exactly, but operating according to a logic that was subtly its own. He turned it over. No inscription. No indication of ownership. He stood in the storage room for a moment, turning the watch in his hands, and then put it in his bag. He wasn't sure why. It seemed too interesting to leave behind, and he had developed, recently, a habit of holding on to things that seemed worth keeping. In the weeks after finding the watch, Kazu carried it everywhere. He told himself it was just an interesting object, something to fidget with when he was thinking. He had cleaned the case and the face as much as he was able, and it sat comfortably in his pocket, its irregular ticking a constant low presence. The first time something strange happened, he dismissed it. He was walking between classes, the watch in his jacket pocket, when he stumbled on a step he had walked up hundreds of times without incident. He felt the familiar lurch of a misstep, braced for the embarrassment of catching himself. And then he was standing at the bottom of the step, one foot just leaving the floor, the stumble having somehow not yet happened. He stood still for a moment, looked at the step, walked up it carefully. He told himself it was the stress, a momentary confusion in his spatial awareness, the kind of thing that happened when you were tired. The second time was a few days later, a conversation in the corridor that he had the distinct and inexplicable sensation of having already had, not the vague déjà vu of familiar patterns, but the specific word-for-word quality of a replay, the other student saying something he already knew they were about to say. When he checked his pocket, his fingers had apparently been resting on the watch's crown. He took the watch out and looked at it. The second hand was positioned at a spot he was almost certain it hadn't been occupying a moment ago. He began experimenting at home, after May had gone to sleep, with the kind of careful attention he brought to studying. He marked the watch's positions. He twisted the small crown, the winding knob, and watched what happened. He noticed that when he turned the second hand backward, gently, a few ticks at a time, there was a sensation like a mild static charge passing through his fingers and then through the rest of him, and then something shifted in the air of the room. The clock on his desk had moved backward. He sat very still for a moment. Then he did it again. A few seconds backward. He walked 3 steps to the right, reversed the second hand, and found himself standing 3 steps to the left of where he had been, in the position he had occupied moments before. His heart was going very fast. He spent the rest of that night in methodical, increasingly convinced experimentation. By morning, he had confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. The watch allowed him to reverse a few seconds of time. He could replay moments. He could undo small things. He sat in the early morning quiet of his room and held the watch and understood that the world had just become, in some fundamental way, different. He was careful in the beginning. He used the watch the way you use a new tool before you're confident in it, sparingly, for small things, paying close attention to the edges. At school, where the opportunities for both humiliation and experimentation were plentiful, he ran quiet tests. Raina's group had not stopped making his life difficult. Small things, mostly a foot in a corridor, something displaced from his bag, a whispered comment timed to land when a teacher was passing. Individually negligible, cumulatively exhausting. With a few-second rewind, he could sidestep most of these. He allowed the attempt to happen, registered its details, reversed, and adjusted his path or position to avoid it. From the outside, it looked like he had simply become more alert. Raina's group noticed that their small harassments were landing less often and concluded, irritably, that he was finally paying attention. Hashi noticed specifically. He tried the same corridor trip 3 times in one afternoon, and each time, bafflingly, Kazu wasn't quite where he expected him to be. On the 4th pass, Kazu stepped aside precisely as Hashi's foot moved forward, and Hashi pitched off balance and fell, embarrassingly, in front of several watching students. Kazu kept walking. The feeling this produced was not satisfaction, exactly. It was something quieter and more complicated. The watch had given him back a few centimeters of control in a world that had taken a great deal more than that from him. He held onto the feeling carefully, aware that it was fragile. The tension at home had not improved. May continued to field questions about Kazu's situation from her own social circles, and each time she did, she returned home with a little less patience. She wasn't wrong that it was affecting her. That much was simply true. She was also, he knew, not entirely unsympathetic. She just had a very limited capacity for sympathy when it cost her something. One evening, she pushed the argument further than usual, threatening to contact the school counselor if he didn't resolve the situation. Kazu, on impulse, turned the second hand back a few ticks while they were arguing, just to buy himself a moment to think, to find a better formulation for what he wanted to say. He found it. He phrased his response more clearly, more calmly, and May's escalation paused, caught off guard by his steadiness. But something else happened. She stopped mid-sentence and pressed her fingers to her forehead with a small, puzzled frown. "What?" she said. It wasn't directed at him. It was directed inward. He put the watch in his pocket and said nothing. She shook her head and continued the argument on a slightly different track, as though the original path had briefly become unavailable to her. The frown remained at the edges of her expression for the rest of the evening. A month after finding the watch, Kazu discovered what the minute hand could do. He was working alone in his room, thinking about the confrontation with Hashi that had happened that morning. Hashi had cornered him in the corridor after school and made his threats very plain. Stay away from the scholarship process, stay out of Raina's path, or the rumors would get louder. Kazu had stood there and taken it because he hadn't known what else to do. The humiliation of it sat in his chest like a splinter he couldn't reach. Almost without thinking, he turned the watch's minute hand backward. One full rotation. The world didn't just shimmer. It convulsed. When his vision cleared, he was standing in the corridor of the school 5 minutes before the confrontation had happened. Students moved past him in the pre-dismissal shuffle, unaware of anything. Hashi was visible at the far end of the hallway, not yet focused on Kazu, not yet purposeful. Kazu exhaled very slowly. He adjusted his route home by 3 minutes. He was out of the building and halfway down the street before Hashi had even begun looking for him. In that moment, he understood that the watch was not a curiosity. It was a weapon, if he chose to use it as one. He walked home in the early evening light, turning that thought over quietly. He gave himself a week to think before he used the minute hand again. In that week, he watched. He paid attention to Raina and Hashi's patterns. When they met, what they discussed, how they coordinated their small campaigns against him. He used a few-second rewind occasionally, mostly for defense, but kept the larger power in reserve. When he finally acted, it was precise. He had watched Hashi time a corridor ambush twice, once in real time, once in a 3-second rewind that let him observe Hashi's positioning without triggering the action. He used that information to map the physical geometry of the situation. Then he let it happen. Hashi extended his foot. Kazu stumbled exactly as planned. And as he did, he turned the minute hand, rewound the 5 minutes that had brought them both to this hallway at this moment, and walked back into the corridor from a slightly different angle. This time, Hashi's foot extended into empty space. The momentum he had loaded into the gesture had nowhere to go. He pitched forward, arms windmilling, and landed on his hands and knees in full view of a group of passing students. The laughter was immediate and unkind. Kazu walked past without looking down, as though he hadn't noticed anything at all. Behind him, he heard Hashi's strangled, furious, bewildered silence. He kept his expression neutral until he turned the corner. Raina knew something was wrong before she could identify what. It was a pattern she recognized because she was fundamentally a pattern reader. The small operations she ran against Kazu had been designed to be deniable and incremental, the kind of pressure that wore a person down without giving them anything specific to push back against. They had worked for a while. He had been visibly suffering in the weeks after the midterm. Quiet, withdrawn, the particular hunched posture of someone braced for impact. But recently something had shifted. The operations were failing. Not failing dramatically, just failing in small ways, in the kinds of ways that shouldn't have been possible unless the target knew in advance what was coming. And Kazu, who was not particularly well-connected socially, had no plausible intelligence network. She filed this under unresolved questions and redirected her attention. The scholarship list. That was the real issue. If Kazu was somehow restored to good standing, if some teacher, moved by his consistent performance, found a way to reinstate him as a candidate, everything she had built would be under pressure. She needed something larger, something unambiguous. She began planning the next phase. The discovery of the hour hands capability was an accident. Raina had escalated. A new rumor, this one involving stolen money from a class fund, specific enough to be damaging, vague enough to be unfalsifiable. Kazu had been called to answer for it in front of the teacher, and the entire situation had a quality of inevitability that he recognized as the product of careful planning. He stood in the teacher's office and felt the familiar closing-in sensation of being trapped by something he hadn't done. His hands were in his pockets. His fingers found the watch. In the frustration of that moment, not thinking clearly, acting on impulse, he grabbed the hour hand and twisted it backward. The world didn't just change. It ended and restarted. When he opened his eyes, it was the previous evening. He was in his bed, in his room, the familiar ceiling above him. Outside the window, The quality of the light was unmistakably yesterday's light. He sat up very slowly. He had jumped back nearly a full day. He sat in the dark of his room and stared at the watch in his hands, understanding with complete certainty that he had just crossed into something that couldn't be uncrossed. Then, very deliberately, he began to plan. He spent what remained of that night working through everything he knew about the following day. Raina's plan involving the class fund had been clever. She had introduced certain documentation, a discrepancy in records, a log that appeared to show Kazu accessing materials he shouldn't have. The teacher had been primed to receive this information, which meant the priming had happened in the days before. Kazu mapped it out from memory, identifying the moments and people involved.